Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So this session today is about gender bias in the academy. We called it gender trouble. Does anyone know why? Gender trouble? Does that ring a bell? It's the title of Judith Butler's 1990 very seminal work where talk about sort of gender as performance. So try to call on that kind of thing. But this is Women, Gender, and Leadership put this together. I also just want to point out that Women in Leadership is now Women, Gender, and Leadership. We went through a title change a couple of years ago now. So just to call your attention to it. It was to be more inclusive, essentially. So we're going to kick it off with some questions. Donna has some.
We're going to do a little, as you see, a show of hands. Okay. So in your evaluations, and you can think your student evaluations from last semester or, overall, how many of you have had students comment on your clothing? How many of you have had students comment on it's kind of part of it, shoes?
Oh,
Yeah.
not for the reason.
I know.
When I wear the Jordans.
I know, we know, yep. Let's see, how many of you have had students give you advice, let's just do that, give you advice on how to teach? Okay, how many of you have had students give you advice such that they, as opposed to you, professor, should select the books that will be used in the class? Okay. How many of you have had an email that goes something like this? I know I'm not doing well in the class, but help me out here. Come on, give me a better grade. Okay. How many of you have had an email request to meet to discuss the final grade, like a negotiation kind of request? How many of you have had students meet with you in your office to discuss their sexual assault or rape? How many of you have had the situation where you've been asked by a student to alter your curriculum because of what we just talked about, the sexual assault or rape? How many of you have been called Mrs. or Mr.? How many of you have been told in an evaluation, my professor makes me read books I don't want to read? Let me see. How many of you, I think I already did that one. How many of you have had comments in your evaluations about your personality? And last one, how many of you, I don't know if this will make sense. How many of you have had comments in your evaluations that talk about your entertainment quotient? Okay, so lots. Cool.
So these are just to kind of get us thinking about what the criteria are that we are judged by in general in the academy, right? I think that we heard a lot, at least I think a lot of us have, heard a lot about how gender bias affects our teaching as teacher to student, right? Do we call on women and men equally in a class discussion? Do we evaluate them the same, right? And I think that we talk less, at least as a group, about how does gender bias affect us in our roles as faculty, right? So just a couple numbers here to kick us off. Women comprise the majority of the professorate, right? But only 44% of tenure-track faculty and 36% of full professors are women. 93% of institutions pay to men more than they do to women for at least one faculty rank. So essentially, if you're a full professor, male faculty are generally getting paid more than female faculty. 30% of college presidents identify as women, only 30%. 70% of male identifying tenured professors have children, while 44% of women do. That one really struck home for me particularly, right? You know, and then you get into issues about sort of work and work expectations coinciding with childbearing years and making decisions, right? Okay, so how did we get here? Today's objective, essentially, we just want you to come away with better understanding of where we encounter gender bias so we can support each other and start to come up with ways that we can combat it in our own institution, right? How did we get here? This workshop came out of a discussion that, in fact, Verna DeLauer, Donna Decker, and myself met for lunch one day because there was an article that came out about 2 studies that had been done recently on evaluations, student evaluations and gender, right? In particular, this one is the one that struck us particularly. Women are rated significantly lower as they age from younger to middle age, with their lowest teaching ratings emerging at age 47. Men don't experience this drop at all, right? So any thoughts about that? Do we have thoughts about what kind of gender bias is at work there?
Old lady bias.
Old lady bias, absolutely, right? What are those things? What is that bias coming from? What do we think about old ladies in our culture and society? Yeah.
I think it's looking at an ageism issue where we sometimes feel that men get older and get more wise, but that doesn't usually seem to apply to women.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, we think about that just in terms of the way we judge appearance in our culture, right? We hear
Turning
this-
gray with our hair,
Yeah.
right? There's
Yeah.
2 different philosophies on that.
Sure, yeah. Carl?
I'm not sure that we can really attach it to just age, given that we evidently have a drop until 47, and I presume a rebound.
I
So does that
guess,
mean
yeah,
there's
that's a good
grandma
point.
benefit or something?
That's a good point. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at,
What about the grandma benefit, say more? Cause I,
Well, you know, I mean, just, after 47, evidently the rate, women's ratings go up. That's the only way to read that.
The lowest is at
You know?
47. What about like Hollywood? Like young women get all these big roles and then they have this, and then they might come back as,
grandmas.
Yeah.
well, or,
Or-
bench or anything. But
Residential.
we have this very different sort of perception that middle of the road for women is just like these lost years where they're like, oh, they're not having kids, they're not. There's so many things that go on with sort of middle age for women that I don't think men necessarily. There's a big transition. here.
Encounter. Yeah.
Yeah, and also for the college students, that's the age of their parents, and they do not like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then why doesn't it emerge for males?
Right, or with the age of their mothers, yeah, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah. That's sort of why I went with this photo, right? Thinking about kind of the taskmaster, old school marm kind of stereotype, right? Just some other things about evaluations, because I think that this is one of the things where this really emerges, the gender bias, and there have been studies for years that indicate these things, right? In 2014, there was a study done that sort of had online students going blind. In fact, part of the study was flipping, right? Revealing, saying an instructor was male when they were actually female, saying an instructor was female when they were male. And in that study, they found that instructors were rated higher when they were perceived to be male than female, regardless of whether they were male or female. And the last one is female instructors are prone to more backlash in evaluations after assigning grades. Any thoughts on that one?
It's real. It's so real.
Yeah.
I just have a question actually. Did they go into at all if that backlash is based on gender specifically of the students? Like do the male students have more of a backlash to the women
That's a
or?
good question.
Okay,
I don't know that specifically
Okay.
in that study. But that, I mean, it's a good question to think about, right? Why do you ask?
oh, I'm just curious, like if, if that's rooted in like a sexism, like if, like a male student is like, would have more of a philosophy of like, how dare she kind of give me this grade, whereas they might not to like a male instructor,
Yeah.
if they see to respect male instructors more than women instructors.
Absolutely, and that is something we have talked about as well, kind of, that, I don't know, I don't have research necessarily that grounds this, but that the expectation of women to be nice kind of then colors their view of what that feedback is saying, right? I always tell my students, when I was writing my dissertation, my advisor, male, right, used to write things, and this is probably the best thing, the thing that boosted my writing more than anything, but he would make comments like blech and ugh, right? And I had a good friend of mine, he had the same advisor, and we were sort of at the same point, and there were no blechs and ughs in his writing, right? I mean, maybe he was a better writer, so that's fine. But yeah, the point is here is that like the perception of that, right? To me, I took it as good. It's boosted me, right? But I'm not sure that my perception would be the same if that came from a female professor.
I had a male student write to me this semester and say, how dare I question his work ethic, which I think it's my job actually to question his work ethic, which was pretty shabby. Just saying.
Go ahead. I don't know, like catchphrases, but like, toxic masculinity, sort of bullying, but then also to your point, there's been a lot of research that says that we're expected to be caregivers.
Yes.
And that the caregivers, so that we get the sympathy pleas, and I have to have this for this, and I need this to keep my, and I feel like the backlash comes from there too.
Sure. That's a good point. Has anyone had criers in their office? Oh my gosh, like every week, especially when I teach FYI. I mean, it's there every week. Lindsay.
I know I always personally battle when you think of advising. Like how do you go about advising? And I think I almost view that as more of from like a motherly perspective. And so I know for me, that's probably the bias I put on it. And I think I put that out to my students in that kind of caregiver role of, and I think that might also set myself up for in the class when I am talking to students about assignments, and I'm not sure, I'm gonna go on a limb and think that caregiver role might be different for women versus men, and I think that might set it, that perception up for students even differently.
The expectation,
Yeah.
right? Good, so this is a good segue, actually. So I thought we'd just take a minute, grab a partner, pair up, groups of three, whatever you want, and discuss these questions, and because we're thinking about the way that we've set this up is to think about gender bias in our student-facing roles, so in the classroom and advising, right? We're going to talk a little bit about gender bias in our service roles as well, our service expectations, and as well as our research expectations. So just want to take a minute and discuss these questions with a partner, and then we can come back and share anything you think is pertinent.
I think, well, I don't know, I have comments about. It's also something.
I actually have. Because I can keep around and so
I've had a couple classes.
That's my whole life.
feel like it's already.
Still, I'm aware of. There's like 3 guys and they won't shut up. And they stop by themselves. Oh,
Yeah.
Such a projection, such a survey. Well, even if they are, like, my daughter, sometimes they never been like, oh, yes, you know, but for some reason, that's entirely reserved for women. First, you get that other level, you apply some sort of like power
I think so, but I don't know how to say that directly to friends. But I guess you might feel more.
Oh, yeah, I do. Very little talk.
My estimation is like idea. I'm trying to get like, you know, essentially.
And I'm not. Whereas like regional.
Yeah. Just your last name.
No.
Yeah, like we're in a park in 1976. It's like, hey, Brevin, excuse me?
We're willing to share.
I don't send like that, I don't tell you. No way, the history books has ever referred, no student has ever called you.
There's a lot of good discussion happening, which is great, but maybe just another minute to think about if there are insights or experiences that you think are worth sharing out to the big group as well. So just another minute or so.
I know the experience too, and sometimes I don't so I would try to be very
They'll like stop coming to class.
It's hard.
Okay, let's come on back together.
Yeah.
I did need to say this, Chris, actually, do you mind monitoring the chat just in case? Yeah, thank you. Zoom participants, you're welcome to contribute in the chat. Okay, what did you talk about? Was there anything specific that you think was insightful or an experience that you want to share? Leslie?
We had our different points of view, male and female, but Carl thinks that I should, well, like, we were talking about things from like the same perspective, but
Yes.
the opposite.
Yes.
Yeah, but Carl wanted me to share that one time I was teaching this online course, I had done them forever, so it was 2 intro to psychs and just in 1, because my name's Leslie, so I just wanted to see what would happen, like that could be male or female. So I changed the picture to a relatively handsome male in one class.
I let her use it.
Generous.
I did find that my evaluations, like, they were pretty good, like they always are in my female class, but in the male Leslie class, it was the top all the way across the board. But I did get accused of sexual harassment in there,
In the male one?
in the male one.
Wow.
Because I realized
Really?
afterwards, I was still like putting in my emojis, exclamation, I think I was being perceived as flirting, you know what I mean?
Interesting.
And I didn't mean to be.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an interesting little
Yeah.
experiment there.
I was like, I'm not forgiving her.
But you think if you were a female doing that, you might not. Other experiences or insights anybody wants to share in that discussion? Yeah, go ahead.
We talked about being the note taker in meetings and how it's often
I'll start.
Can you speak up, Lou? I said we talked about being the note taker in meetings and how often it's
I refuse.
Yep.
I asked how we solved that and would you say you said?
I said you take minutes. Yeah, you gotta step up.
True. Anything else?
We talked about names, like what we're called,
Oh, interesting.
and my male colleagues here made reference to them being called just by their last name, which I don't think, so a student would use the last name only directly to you. And I've never had that. But I also don't get called my first name either, which, brings up a whole range of gendered
Yeah.
issues.
It's interesting you bring that up because I was thinking about this too, and I've always said you can call me Jess, right? And more, the older I get, the less they call me by my first name. Now I'm Mrs. Which I always correct to Mrs. I don't mind Miss so much, but Mrs. I'm like, nah. You see a ring on this finger? No, thank you. Anyway, moving on. Anything else you want to share? Christina?
Just to come back to Mari's point, I've always defaulted to sort of a more masculine, where I tell them to call me by my last name. So Dr. Cliff is fine, Professor Cliff is fine, or just Cliff is fine. It's never Christina and it's never Miss or Mrs. But that's always been my default but I noticed that that's what they typically call us when they're talking to each other. Like they don't add titles when they're talking to each other, right? So I end up not getting the wrong name hardly ever because they're defaulting to what they do when they're not around me.
Yeah.
But it is a very masculine sort of approach to it, and it was just what I was always used to.
Yeah, sure. I always feel like they think I'm on a team with them when they're like,
It's a sports thing.
yeah, it's a sports thing, yeah.
I was gonna say Lisa Obama, doesn't look like she's on here, but she had complained last year that they were just calling her Obama, which she felt that was disrespectful and coming more from the males.
Sure. Interesting. Coming more from the males is interesting.
I guess my other question would be, how many of us tell them what to call us on the first day of class? Because that's the other thing, is that that's what I do, and so,
That's what I.
yeah, I always have, but
Is that respected mostly when you say that?
Sometimes.
Okay. Anything else you want to share? Leslie, go ahead.
Well, I mean, this is kind of weird, but one time a student shut the door when I was younger and propositioned me, and when I was saying that to Carl, he was saying that he would have been worried the other way. Like, he wouldn't want a student to shut the door because he would be worried that it would be perceived the other way.
Yep.
Yeah, Yeah, that's a good point, the door, open or shut door when you meet with them one-on-one, for sure. Yeah, Chris?
So on the chat, Jenny mentioned that she notices that she gets fewer compliments as she gets older with regards to things like how she's dressed or whatnot. But not on evaluations, more face to face.
More face-to-face.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And she does have a question, less than an observation. She's with regard to your statistics earlier, she said, what is the discrepancy in pay for male versus female professors?
Say that again?
Do we know the
Pay?
discrepancy in pay between male and female?
Jenny, it's a great question again. I was just sort of using broad statistics and I'm not real well rehearsed in
We'll find out.
the specifics, but we can find out. We can find out. It's a good question.
Males get higher starting pay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just kind of glancing through, researching and looking at, some quick questions that people ask. And one of the questions that was repeated several times was, what do you call a female professor? And the answer was professor. It's like, who's asking these questions?
Well, it's like they're looking for the actor, actress.
Apparently,
version.
yeah, professoress.
Yeah.
Try to say okay, so I do think that these kinds of discussions kind of highlight some of the dilemmas that women in leadership in general, and I'm thinking here as an instructor in front of a classroom, right? The dilemmas that they face. And one is thinking about sort of your competence versus likability. Like, what are they perceiving you? Do they want to like you more than they want to perceive you as an expert? This is something, again, that we've discussed quite a bit, that, do you want to tell your story about the books, choosing the books, or no?
Oh, well, yeah, I mentioned it a little bit, but at the end of one course, I had a student who's like, I'm gonna give you some advice. And very assertively said, students like choice. Like, I haven't been here 30 years. I'm like, oh, do tell. And she said, what I think you should do is in the summer, before the fall, send out a list of books you're considering, and then we will tell you which ones to pick.
Wow.
And I said, on what basis would you do that since y'all don't read? And they said, we will Google. And I said, thank you very much. No.
And follow that with the question.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. And then I said, so do you, for your biology professors, you asked if you could pick the task, or your physics professors or your kinesiology professor, you asked that too. Well, no, that's different. And then, then we went down the path. Anyway.
I also think that points to a sort of gender bias that's baked into particular fields of study as well, right? It skews more humanities than science kind of things, but that one always strikes me as
But I wouldn't even say just gender bias. You get into more of the emotional connections and all of that. I'm getting into the, objective nitty gritty, the muscle attachment. So I think sometimes I give you great kudos for diving into the world of that brings out emotions and viewpoints and perhaps the softer side of people's interpretation of the world. So, that's a challenging aspect in general.
Sure. The other thing that comes up obviously is that women, if you present as assertive in the classroom, you also get perceived as abrasive rather than assertive and knowing your job and knowing what you want them to do, right? And the expectation of emotional labor, this came up already, right? Especially in advising. And I think with first year students, this gets heightened. I think that those of us in the room who've taught FYI, right, can attest to that. And the perception is that women are better at it, right? Any FYI instructors, do you have your FYI students coming to you for advising well past the time when you're advising the two of you? Anybody else?
I have seniors
Yeah.
now, that I had 4 years ago.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. But you're better at it. You talk me through it. You're better at it. You're this, you're that, right? And we have to think about how that affects the perception of our time, not just the perception of our time, the actual time that we are putting in, and then the emotional labor that goes into making those connections that they see as then the sort of well that they can yank water out of for a long time.
Are women better at it?
No,
I wouldn't say that that's a statement that you can make.
agree.
across the board.
What, because of their physical bodies, like what?
No, just emotionally, discrepancy between men and women, men being more aloof and cold.
No.
Well, I mean, I think to your point, Tom, to your point, I mean, maybe that's something that we're talking about here too, is like, how do we help our students overcome that perception, right? Yeah, Susan.
Oh, I was just gonna say that there are good advisors and bad advisors. And that I don't think is gender driven necessarily. I
Right,
think it's like understanding what your job is.
right.
And some people are really not good at it. They're great professors, right, in their field, whatever it is. But as far as helping a student figure out what they want to do here, so I think, although it might be sort of tedious to have students from freshman to senior year,
I mean, I
but
like
it's
it in some
also,
ways.
we're small enough that that's kind of a good sign to
Sure.
me. That's a really positive sign of kids that decided to stay here and want to stay in touch and have built kind of friendships and, I mean, it's beyond advising at some point.
Yeah, I think that's.
But that's- I don't think that's-
Women
I
are
think that's
better
good.
at child rearing,
Oh,
right?
please.
Oh my God, Tom.
I mean, that's so embedded in our culture.
Tom.
No, he's just describing what
He's saying there's a perception of that.
I know, but that perception is so embedded in our culture.
I know that this is against the tide. I don't know if Tom would agree with this, but I know many people. I think we are socialized differently. And that's going to change the way we interact with each other and with students. So, maybe women are better, and I'll use that in quotes, but because women have been socialized to have different kinds of relationships, and that doesn't mean guys can't be good advisors or, some female faculty, are more distant or whatever, but I think if we're going to talk kind of patterns or percentages or whatever, not that it's built into our biologies, but we are socialized to interact with people differently, and that's going to show up in our teaching and our advising.
And I think that's part of the project that I see workshops like this doing,
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Is then, and then going in, if we know those things going in, then we can actively work against those sort of patterns that put us into boxes.
And we can directly respond to students
Yes.
who are making assumptions about us or about our colleagues.
Yeah. Martin.
Just to follow on that, I think there's a deep socialization around the perception that men's time is more valuable than women's, and it's kind of not written anywhere, but it's maybe, and this is very anecdotal, but I think a lot of students perceive women have more time to listen and kind of be a metaphorical shoulder to cry on a lot of times. Now that's very anecdotal and it doesn't apply to everyone, but I remember with Doug, Lord rest him, that he would forever saying to me to stop meeting with students for so long, stop taking so long with them. That was an everyday piece of advice I got, but he too was able to talk for a long time and meet with students. So, but there are different sets of socializations there and perceptions, and I just want to add to that first bullet, the competence for. Nobody wants a classroom where people are stressed and the atmosphere is not good. Nobody wants that. So I think it is a kind of a crucible, a gendered crucible to kind of get that balance between
those
competence
two.
and likability and assertive, all of those characteristics there. And it's not easy. And I'm not sure it's changed much lately either. I don't think so.
Leslie.
I guess I don't know if this is the flip side of this, but I dislike being told that my preferred style of advising is to, I don't know, emotional labor, I don't want to say that expectation, but my preferred style is more like hands-on. Like, well, that's wrong. Like, that's a woman thing. You shouldn't do that because that's how women do it. I'm like, then, like, that's what I am and that's what works for me. Like, I don't have to do it a man's way because that's like doesn't work for me, so don't tell me the way that I'm doing it is wrong.
Sure.
Well, maybe that's, isn't that the kind of the point though, is that it should be advising that works best for you and your students. I don't give a damn which parts come along with biological parts come with that, right?
Right.
So how you do the advising should work for you. To Mari's point, yes, because Doug, an occasion would be like, why are those students still in your office? But we shared an office wall, and I think that was part of it, right? He's like, I can hear them. But that's what works. And I had students come in and they're like, oh, well, I know you're gonna be sitting in your office not doing anything. So I'll come tell you. I'm like, well, admittedly, that's probably true, but they call me on it.
Yeah.
How many breakups have we been through?
No.
Oh my God.
Yeah, well, I mean, this comes up too, I think, I lost my thought. I'm not gonna hand it to Lindsay because I lost my thought. Go ahead, Lindsay.
I was gonna say, I think we all view this through our own generational lens, and there's a couple different generations here. And I get really excited when I listen to my own high school children look at gender and options and requirements and responsibilities. And I know sometimes they're in that age where they're not sure what they are saying is appropriate or how they're navigating things, but I feel like every generation there's a shift. And I have no doubt that we are shifting in a direction that is a little bit more neutral on some of these biases, because my favorite area to work in the clinical world is in the geriatric population of, I'm talking like 80-year-olds. But there I am viewed as a mother, and there's some patients I can't evaluate because I'm not viewed as a clinician. Like, so, I'm a whole different role. So, but I don't see that in the generations coming forward. So I do think even here, we all have our own generational lens we view things through. And it just, to me, I think that brings a great depth of color to the conversation.
Yeah, Chad.
Well, Frank.
Oh, Frank, sorry.
Well, we had an exchange with Gianna here where she was talking about how much they share personal lives, experiences with her. So I'm attentive as an advisor, but I do not get a lot of personal life sharing from them. Probably, and not nearly as much as what Gianna was telling me. And I get the sense, just by being by you two for as long as I have, that they do a lot more of that with you than with me. I can just get down to brass tacks. I mean, I'll mentor, but it's strictly on academic planning, career planning, grad school. I mean, it's really just academic or career matters.
You don't
not
do
personal
breakups.
stuff. No. No. I mean, it's
You
not.
would send them next door or across the hall.
I won't send them anywhere. I mean, I'm willing to, they just aren't forthcoming, but I've noticed that, and I'm not eavesdropping, but I just know, I can tell from the body, just from the dynamic, that they're sitting and they're confiding in you about personal, at least that's what I sense, and I don't get that, which is fine. And then also, I mentioned to the group that being next to Donna for about 24, 25 years now, I've been in the office, Donna has a very different experience with what students say to her in her office and what they say.
Yeah, regarding the generational changes, we also have a situation where the student body is becoming more and more female, right? And I don't know whether that's more likely to make the males feel like they're the rarefied individuals who get away with more or take more liberties, or whether it will actually go the other direction and balance things out better down the road. The other thing I was thinking of was we have a student who's very motivated, very focused, very driven, very assertive, and a little annoying. And when we were discussing this with a couple of my female colleagues, they were like, assertive, they're aggressive, and they're inappropriate, and they're rude. And I'm like, oh, I haven't seen that.
And that's a whole other issue, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about how the population and that more women are graduating college, that kind of thing. And what's interesting to me about that point is that we haven't seen that shift happen necessarily in the workforce yet, right? That like leadership and management positions and things like that. Like I always tell my students, the perception that women belong in the kitchen Yet who are the most lauded top chefs in the world are often men, right? And so even the things that are in the purview of women, in quotes, right, get sort of dominated by men. So, this disparity, I'm interested to see in the next 20 years how that plays out, right, within the workforce. Alan.
Yeah, two quick points. One is in response to Frank and Donna. I have an experience closer to Frank, not only because I'm male, I think, but because I'm not exactly a warm fuzzy. That's news to most of you probably. But when a student does confide or open to me, I'm more likely to make suggestions that they go to the counseling center or a place like that, than to deal with it. And that's in part because I feel uncomfortable, but I also feel unqualified. I would talk to a friend, but they're not my friends. They're my students, and I don't feel comfortable in that role. But let me also really quickly respond to Lindsay's point about, we should be able to do what we feel most comfortable with and most capable. I think there's another part, I think that's true, but I think there's also another part of it, which is why I think discussions like this are important. I think we need to do what we feel comfortable with, but also recognize other people. So for example, going back to the note-taking, guys don't take notes because what we have to say is important and we want a chance to say it. And if we're taking notes, we can't be following the conversation and formulating thoughts and things like that. So, it isn't just, well, I'll be nice and I'll take notes. Actually, that changes the dynamic. And if I'm aware of kind of why I'm using the privilege of not taking notes, maybe I will listen to other people actually better.
Sure.
Or more attentive.
Yeah, and I say that to my students a lot in Intro to Women's Studies, because they'll come in with perceptions about usually midway through the semester, someone will say something like, I feel like feminism doesn't want me to wear lipstick, right? Or something like that. And then we talk about kind of the difference between complicity in a system that you were socialized in, right? And that the kind of first step of maybe changing some of that socialization or the perceptions, things like that, is the recognition and discussion around it, right? So that we're more aware of what it is we're complicit in, right? And then maybe how to change it. So just moving on, this has been a great discussion so far. Just a couple of other things. We've touched on some of these, so gender bias in service, roles. I mean, one of the things that we have been talking about is we wondered if you all see a gender bias in committee membership and leadership, or what faculty service tasks and roles are led disproportionately by women. Any thoughts?
Chairs of committees.
Yeah, we were thinking about, can we name the chairs of our committees right now?
I'm chair of fact,
I'm chair of Black.
Lindsay's chair of curriculum.
It's the chairmanship, so to speak, is
I think it's only
heavily
recently
female this year.
shifted though, because
Yeah.
I think if we did this 2 years ago, I think the chairs were different. So I think there has been some, shifting, and I don't know if historically it stays on one sex or the other, but.
I would attribute a certain amount of that to the chair from one year just sort of by default becoming the chair the next. So even though you may have said, well, Fred Rogers was chair of curriculum for a long time. Andrea was chair prior to that for a long time. It does tend to be a position that's held for a while, is my point on that.
I just from running committee elections for a while, the way people nominate themselves for different committees have different makeups. And so gender makeups, I think, and then the people that get voted on to those committees, I think does have a little bit of a gender bias. So if you're talking about what was I thinking of? Faculty development. Faculty development is I think there's a little bit of a sort of unconscious bias that it's a softer committee, for instance, and so you end up with some. I think this is just
Let me
again,
just tell you, I'm
I think
paying for that attitude.
Right. But I also think when we have like these sudden openings, virtually every time the first person is nominated are going to be, because they feel like they I don't know why, but usually
You
that's
give with faculty development.
Oh, I want to make sure I help. Yeah, faculty development, but all of them is that women are very often most likely wants to self-nominate, volunteer.
Maybe also feeling they have to prove something.
That's true.
Well, I also think it has to do with who we're hiring as junior faculty members too, is that if we're hiring more women coming in, then they're the ones who need service. And so you kind of have to also look at the hiring patterns.
Are we doing that? I don't know. Are we
Well-
hiring more incoming women?
Well, all right, so like, I'm just thinking about like the people don't know Katie Beth has taken another
Yeah.
position. And so the revolving door that is the reference librarian position has opened again. But that has alternated like pretty much between men and women almost each time.
Yeah.
And so, but that's what I'm saying is I'm not aware of what the hiring patterns are in other departments, but I think that would be
We
something.
can't hire, so.
Right, but so that I think that's what you would have to also look at because it's the incoming people who need service.
Just want to point out before we get too hung up on the committee thing that I don't know that it's a terribly good example for measuring any kind of bias, maybe from the standpoint of leadership within the committee or something like that. But one of our big problems, frankly, is we have a limited faculty size and a lot of positions on committees, and you can only hold one. So, on a very real level, okay, we're gonna be replacing Fred Rogers. I'll be putting out an email to that effect on tomorrow, a call for nominations. Look down the list of, okay, now, how many people are actually not on the committee to even be available to take on that position? I think the similarity between faculty size and number of positions
Affects this
kind
for
of
sure.
makes that.
Yeah, I was thinking more like 5 years back, when we were a little bit larger faculty and so, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
What's the breakdown of
Anne
male,
speaking for a
female
minute, Tom.
You mean,
in our faculty?
Tom, just for a second, Anne's on. Then you can go.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Donna.
Donna.
So I'm gonna go off just a little bit off topic to say, when I think about my community and the service pieces that are going on there, there are, almost exclusively women are on, the library committee and the political committee and the school board and select board pieces, the males tend to, this is just my little community, tend to have a sort of, they're like trophies, that sort of trophy role. Like, here I am on the select board, but I'm actually not going to do any work. I'm not joining any of the committees, and if you put me on a committee, I'm not going. So the real work that gets done, and there's a lot of backlash too. Now that there's 3 women on the select board, well, they are certainly talking secretively behind the scenes too. It is kind of true, but our agenda. So it's really interesting to me to see like how our communities, some of that, the real work that's getting done. That's why I talk. We're talking about how we're gonna get it done, and we might give you and there's sort of some, I think about the role as a note taker, like, do we really trust him to really focus and get it done? Like, there's a lot of bias in those pieces, and it really shows up in those kinds of environments.
Thank you. Tom?
Oh, do you know what the breakdown is, male, female percentages of our faculty?
faculty, I don't know. I mean,
I'm not sure I know.
if they want to wait or guess.
I always thought there were more females, just from my.
Yeah, we should be able to, I'll get that. We should know that.
Seems like it's probably based on college too. I feel like our college is probably more people.
Majority.
Yeah.
Just a couple last things, we'll skip this. Been thinking through the other thing I just want to point out is gender bias does show up in our research roles as well. particularly with representation in fields of study. There was just some stats that I thought were kind of amazing. Researchers simulated academic ranks that are aligned with research performance, right? And found with all else equal, there would be 9% more female full professors in Italy and 6.5% more female professors in Norway. Basically saying that the same criteria are not being applied, right, for a boost in rank. Female faculty advisee and service loads across, this was a national study across the nation, negative, they take on more of those. Women have more, female faculty have more advisees in general. And they also take on higher service loads. Obviously, that affects your research productivity then, right? Double-blind peer review instituted, the acceptance of women-authored submissions increased. This has been called into question recently in the last few years. Just wanted to throw that out there. I also wanted to ask, women in STEM in this room in particular, right? One of the things we talked about is under 20% worldwide of engineers are female, right? How does that play out here? Like, where is that bias coming through at Franklin Pierce in terms of women in STEM? Any thoughts about that? Is it something you talk about with your students? Yeah.
We're not a good example of that. We only have S.
Sorry, say that again.
We only have S.
Yeah.
We don't have TEM.
Yeah. Oh.
We have
Like, what's
S.
he saying?
S&M.
I don't get it.
We got a class
I mean,
for
I think though, he's right, but the Frank is not a good example another way because, in our chemistry and math classes, it's predominantly female. And I have this spring in organic chemistry, I have 25 females and 1 male.
Yeah. This used to play out in the honors sections, even of composition and things like that, because our honors program was for a really long time intensely dominated by women,
Yep.
right? And the majority of those students at least were
Yep.
health science students. Yeah.
My sister is a mechanical engineer, and I know one of the reasons she picked that career path was she wanted to have a career that was in the math and science field but she could stand out in. And she went to UNH, and it was huge. And she was a very small percentage of females in that. And she's short, and she's got short blonde hair, and she had her cute little nose ring and her spiky little collar, and she could apply to any place and get hired. And just because that's what they were looking for females to fit that role. She's very good at her job. But she found, even being employed in those fields, they were always asking her, oh, can you be in our educational video? Can you do that? And so she just found like that was, yes, and it was that way. A lot of times she was hired in a company where every other employee was male and 40 years older than her. So very different dynamics. I think Carl's right. We don't have that dynamic here. Our STEM is mostly science and it's mostly medicine. And I think in our world of science and medicine, that's starting to at least the pre-med, even itself out more, not so much in the field of medicine, but.
Yeah, it's time. So just last thing, just a couple of, obviously we can't solve this problem here and now, right? But just some of the things that we thought might help in these situations that curb gender bias is to share information with your students, right? Talk about it. Have them recognize their own gender assumptions about you and their peers, right? Say up front, studies show, evaluations, women, whatever you might bring up. Have female voices in your curriculum. I think in English and composition, this has been something that, for 20 years we've been talking about changing the canon and putting more women authors in there. But I'm not sure that we think about that so much when we think about textbook authors or articles that we assign, things like that. Consciously choosing to work outside gender expectations. So setting a goal for yourself, for women, do you want to be more assertive in the classroom? Do you want to protect your time in different ways, right? And then paying attention to the burden that your colleagues might be taking on, especially the burdens that they're taking on, that women, non-binary, and BIPOC colleagues are taking on. So any other suggestions? Things we can do to actively combat these things? Okay, well, we're not solving the world's problems, but I think it's a good discussion. Thank you all for coming.